Yeah. I'm appealing to the best of you. If my mama didn't raise me right, I wouldn't be addressing you. I'll be on my knees begging you. These babies deserve better than blurbs and newsletters or decisions about their futures that have arms dealers earn better. In addition to the smugglers, the looters, oil barons, and air polluters, killer telecommuters, shooting bombs off drones, officers close enough to home to be dozing off by 8 with little trauma signs shown. Come on. Pundits adding to the drama, one that flaunts a devil's thumbprint, but that index pulling triggers is in charge. When the body it's connected to's in uniform garb, ain't that something? Trust me, they don't hate your freedom. It's the lies they find repugnant, it's the wars and the coups, propping up a dictator, short-term memory, long-range missile radius, and the craziest election rhetoric imaginable. How we will claim some more high ground, this is unfathomable. The fact that Black Lives Matter has to even be said is telling. Back in 08, it was hope and chain selling. 8 years later, some Great Lakes waters were strained smelling, and Syrian lives shattered from a barrel bomb shelling on an hourly basis. While our cowardly faces stared at a camera phone reflection, drowned away in disgrace. Hundreds of thousands were plundered by thundering rounds of obliterating agony. World leaders would rather lead us to believe they're being liberators. Actually, man, the older I get, I find the meaning of freedom is relative. Shit, it doesn't even mean the same to me and my relatives. Democracy on a high horse, a high off of sedatives. Keeping up with the Joneses, that ain't being competitive. Now I'm no longer in debt, but still feel like I'm getting it. The misuse of my tax dollars, getting repetitive. Meditative retreats were all that kept me from losing. And now I look in my son's eyes to find what is relevant. Gibran, the best medicine. But if we had tried to immigrate today, they wouldn't let us in. The sun's settling. Yeah, the sun's settling.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to No to APEC, No to War. This is our June build-up event from the Pacific Northwest People Over Profit Coalition. As folks are still joining the call, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and get to know each other. We're so happy that everyone's able to be here tonight. It looks like we've got some folks calling in from South Seattle. We've got folks here from Maryland. We've got folks calling in from occupied Hawaii, from Anakbayan UC. We've got people from SoCal in the chat, Queens, Tacoma. It looks like we've got a great turnout here tonight. And we've got at least 2 live watch parties. So hello to everyone who's in Seattle at University of Washington and folks at the Bayanihan Center in Portland. Thank you all for joining. We'll give people just 1 or 2 more minutes to join the call tonight. And then we'll get started at about 6:05. And again, if you just joined, welcome to the No to APEC, No to War event on resisting free trade and the buildup to war in the Asia Pacific. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and get to know each other. And if you're in person, please feel free to get to know the folks that you are there with. Yeah, we'll get started in just about 1 minute. All right, welcome everybody. We can get started now. My name is Carly Brook, and I'm part of the Resist US-led War Movement Global Secretariat, and I am also a part of the Pacific Northwest People Over Profit Coalition. And this is our June build-up event in our No to APEC campaign. Tonight, we'll be talking about how to resist free trade and the build-up to war in the Asia Pacific, make the connections between some of the economic mechanisms of US control over the Asia Pacific, like the new free trade deal, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the military strategies of the US, including the pivot to the Asia Pacific. For tonight, as we get into this discussion, a couple of logistics reminders. We hope that folks will be able to use the chat to interact with each other, to comment on your thoughts, to share how you're getting involved in the fight against APEC and IPEF and neoliberalism in general. But please stay on mute so that we can really maximize our time and everyone's participation. If you have questions that come up throughout the event, please also use the chat to submit those questions. We will have a Q&A at the end. And we are live streaming on Resist's Facebook page. So if you go to Resist US-led War Movement on Facebook, you will find our live stream, and we hope that you will share this event with your community, with your friends, with your comrades. And yeah, we will also send out a recording after the event to all participants. So again, welcome everyone, and we're really excited to get started, excited to fight back against these anti-people free trade deals, and looking forward to learning from you all. And yeah, I'll pass it off to Robin with PNW Pop to introduce the coalition.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robin. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a member of Pacific Northwest People Over Profit Coalition. We are a coalition of organizations, alliances, and labor groups who are committed to confronting the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, conference during the August 2023 ministerial meetings in Seattle. So APEC is an intergovernmental forum with the purpose of preserving the neoliberal status quo and serving state and corporate interests. What that means is basically it creates economic guidelines that focus on things like opening up economies in Asia to investment by multinational corporations, deregulation that hurts jobs, wages, labor rights, climate action and the environment, consumer privacy, and helps to boost corporate monopoly power. At the APEC conference in summer of this year, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, will be negotiated. This is an agreement that will cover 40% of the global GDP, but the negotiations have no oversight or representation of labor. Instead, they have big corporations lobbying to get their interests represented. All of this is part of what you would call the US pivot to Asia, the increased economic and military presence in Asia that is specifically a response to the increasing influence of China in the region. So since these meetings happen behind closed doors, we are ensuring we, Pacific Northwest People Over Profit, are ensuring that demands for worker-centered, climate-friendly trade policy are front and center for the public to see during the Seattle APEC ministerial meetings. We want to bring together an international anti-imperialist coalition of cross-sector organizations to educate and mobilize against IPEF and APEC specifically, and neoliberal and imperialist oppression globally.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, it's been really exciting to work with Pacific Northwest People Over Profit, or PNW Pop. And we hope that after tonight's event, you'll join the many organizations that are committed to fighting against APEC during their meetings in Seattle. this August and July and August. Briefly, I'll introduce the Resist US-led war movement, the co-host of tonight's build-up activity. Resist US-led war movement is a broad global network that unites a global mass movement against US-led imperialist war and militarism by encouraging coordination and cooperation amongst anti-war and peace groups across the globe. And if you're interested in learning more about Resist after tonight, we would love to connect more with you as well. And yeah, shout out to Resist in Seattle, who's hosting one of our in-person live streams of the event tonight. Next slide, please. So for tonight, we will kick it off by introducing a framework. We will share a bit of history about the development of the US pivot to Asia Pacific. How did it develop? What are some of the consequences? And then we'll talk about what does it look like? What are the impacts primarily on the people who are most impacted by free trade deals and militarization in Asia Pacific. We'll talk a little bit about the free trade deal that's being negotiated by APEC by the US this year, called IPEF. And then it's really important to us in Resist and PNW Pop to hear directly from the front lines, to include and organize alongside the communities that are most directly affected by the militarization and false solutions that neoliberal trade deals offer. So we'll hear from comrades in Japan, Korea, and the Philippines, so we can understand a little better what people in Asia Pacific are up against. Then we'll zoom into 2 live watch parties right here in the Pacific Northwest, and folks will share how they're getting ready to fight back against APEC and what their resistance looks like to APEC and war. And then at the end, we'll share how to get involved and open it up to a Q&A. So yeah, we're really looking forward to tonight's conversation. Again, if you just joined, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and feel free to share your comments throughout the event tonight. Next slide, please. All right, so to get us started, a lot of what we've been doing with Pacific Northwest POP is trying to pick apart the logic of neoliberalism, of the sort of global corporate elite, and understand really what are their interests and what will be the impacts if corporations and the ruling class get their way in these negotiations. So this quote recently came out after the meetings that APEC had in Detroit, where they were starting to negotiate IPEF. The quote is, "IPEF partners are exploring ways to pursue their respective climate goals." This is one of their pillars, sustainability. Together, they will advance cooperation on research, development, commercialization, availability, accessibility, deployment of clean energy and climate-friendly technologies, and facilitate investment toward climate-related projects in the region. IPEF partners will achieve this through connecting markets. But what do they really mean when they talk about sustainability? On the left here, you can see images of solar-powered drones, or used by the Department of Defense in many of the military operations that have included bombing civilians. You can see examples of the second picture, facial recognition technology that's also used by the Air Force in its military operations abroad. And here at the bottom, you can see the consequences of lithium mining that's happening in Kashmir, where there was just a multi-billion-dollar, $410 billion deposit of lithium discovered that will be mined to create more battery-powered technologies. So when we're trying to, next slide, please, green the military or create green tech and digital trade within IPEF, what we can see is the strategy that's really a new rallying call for war. When the Asia Pacific is discussed by the United States, we can really see that the US is trying to use militarization to back up its agenda to create a liberalized Asia Pacific region. And as the US is gearing up to host the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, they're really trying to further align the economies of the region towards Western imperialist interests. And this happens under the leadership of the US. So when they're creating green tech, talking about sustainability, we should be critical and understand that the US wants to supply critical mineral resources and the digital infrastructure needed to supply the weapons and tech that the US needs to assert their military dominance in the region. Let's go to the next slide, please. So yeah, to get us sort of set up in a framework, we need to understand, back one slide, please. What does the economic and territorial division of the world look like in this current stage of our global economy? We're living under the system of imperialism, the US being the largest and most dominant current imperialist power. And it is the strategy of imperialism and of imperialist countries to divide the world among themselves. So if you look at this chart on the left, the US military spending of the US compared to the rest of the world, you can see the outsized share, the bloating of our current national military budget, which goes up every single year. And I think this might even be out of date. So it's even higher now, over $800 billion. And if you look at the graphic on the right, you can see how the different countries all around the world plan to create spheres of influence and enter into negotiations together to try and dominate this particular resource-rich region, where APEC covers 41% of the world's population, 44% of the world's trade, and 51% of the world's GDP. So as these negotiations come to Seattle this July, and then onto the Bay in November, we can really think about how does the US try and establish its economic and territorial dominance over the entire world, whether this be through new military agreements, through arming proxies and defending supply chains, through overseas military bases, through new military exercises, or especially through IPEF, through new tech and innovation that makes the military more lethal, increases its pollution and carbon emissions, and makes the world a more dangerous place for the majority of the world's people. So yeah, to just lay down some of the framework that connects the US pivot to the Pacific, this military strategy, with the economic strategy of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, or IPEF. We wanted to kick it off with that. And from here, I will pass it off to my comrade, Rhonda Ramiro, with Resist US-Led War, to explain a little bit more about the pivot to Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Carly. Hi, everybody. I'm Rhonda with the Resist US-Led War movement. Very excited to be here and excited to be taking on APEC and IPEF with you this year. If we can move to the next slide. We're just going to do a little bit of context setting, providing a timeline to how did we get to where we are here in 2023. This timeline starts at 2007, but really we can go even further back into history, not too far, but when you think about APEC and trade and the Asia Pacific region, really it's important to know that the Asia Pacific region has been significant for trade for centuries. But it did take on a kind of a new significance in the dawn of imperialism. The trade routes that were there for centuries before still exist today. Much of these, the maritime trade routes through which so much of the world economy, relies on. At the end of the Cold War, so the world saw like economic crisis and mass unrest as the U.S. began to assert its, kind of triumphalism. Like it was the biggest superpower in the world at the end of the Cold War and with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it started to begin to conduct direct military, or even more so, not that it wasn't doing this before, but kind of an intensification of direct military invasions and major expansion of its bases around the world to, where we are today, anywhere from 800 to 1,000. The exact number is unknown, of this massive military military infrastructure, including bases and installations around the world. So this really exploded after the end of the Cold War. In 2001, we did have the new so-called war on terror that was declared by the United States, kind of a doctrine of endless war and counterinsurgency, in particular in sort of the Southwest Asia, North Africa region. But at the same time, you also saw some other changes happening in the world, right? The US started to overstretch itself militarily. Economically, the economy was also starting to decline. And China was starting to become a major player, not just as like the world's factory, but in its own production. And so you had China kind of on the rise as an economic competitor of the United States. This intensification of competition in the economic sphere then led to intensification in the military sphere, because in order for the US to try and continue staying on top in the economic realm, it needed to be able to back itself up, or it would use the military. Like Carly said earlier, it always uses the military in order to enforce and force its economic agenda. And this is what we saw happening in the early to mid 2000s. Pretty early on, and it's not reflected on this timeline here, but in 2002, you did also see kind of a realignment starting to happen, where you had China and Russia and some other countries coming together under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So kind of a security alliance, as a counterweight to the United States. And then by the time of 2008, we have the financial crisis. The world plunges into this deep recession. The United States, also being impacted by that major recession and really not recovering since then. And then needing to somehow try and cling on to its position in the world. So you have this intensification of competition in the economic sphere. And what comes up next is the identification of the Asia Pacific as a key place for the United States to invest even more, both economically, in trade, and most definitely in terms of the military. So getting back to the slide and this timeline here that's on the slide, just to note, in 2007, as it says here, the Quad, or the quadrilateral security dialogue, which was forged between the US, Japan, Australia, and India, originally was formed supposedly to be able to cooperate for these nations to cooperate in disaster response and humanitarian aid. It was formed kind of in the wake of the tsunami that happened in 2004. It kind of floundered for the first few years, was sort of an unofficial body, but then by 2007, it became a formalized body. This is happening as China, again, is on the rise, but the countries within the Quad, particularly India, didn't quite stake out, its firm commitment to the Quad, not yet at this time. By 2011, the US starts to talk about its Pacific Century. The APEC forum is hosted in Hawaii, and there it definitely is a topic of the Pacific Century for the United States, and the desire of the US to be able to strengthen its position in the world by pivoting to the Asia Pacific. So by 2012, you have a more official declaration of the pivot to Asia, where at the NATO summit, which happened in the United States at that time. So, what better place to announce this pivot to Asia than at the meeting of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the other, kind of preeminent alliance, US-led alliance for war, war-making alliance. So, what is this pivot to Asia that we're talking about? How can we explain the pivot to Asia? Officially, the United States looks at declared the pivot to Asia as a way to secure, yes, its position in the world, and to let me just my notes. I just lost the page here. My document closed. Oh no, where did it go? Here we go. Okay, so the pivot to Asia is the US's declaration of its new strategy of rebalancing its military from, the places where it was focused on in the so-called war on terror to the Asia Pacific region. In its declaration of the pivot to Asia, it refers quite a bit to its economic agenda in the region. So, it talks about the area being home to 60% of the world's people, so much of the world's trade and commerce being focused in the area. And that the pivot would be necessary in order to influence the development of the Asia Pacific. And particularly, and this is, in the body of this declaration, particularly as China emerges as a more influential regional power. And so, it's not about furthering, making things better for everybody, but it's, about ensuring that the influence of China is put in check. I mean, it's very clear from the start of this pivot to Asia that the United States saw China as a growing threat to its position in the world. Now, it's not, even though it was something that came about under the Obama administration, much of it was, really a continuation or even expansion of policies that were already in place from previous administrations. And even just, in the immediate administration before President Bush, where he emphasized strengthening of relations with existing allies in Asia, and had been involved in negotiations of free trade agreements, for example, with South Korea, and kind of laying the groundwork for the Trans-Pacific partnership, which would be introduced during the Obama administration. So these were steps being put in place to launch this new security framework that has really dominated so much of U.S. military buildup from that point onward to today. And when we look at the trade war that is being waged against China, it's at the same time that the pivot to Asia is also being declared as a priority. And if we take a look at the national security strategy of the United States over the years, and definitely the most current one, it is absolutely very clear about the about its intention to counter the rise of China. And just kind of to read from the horse's mouth, or to hear straight from the horse's mouth of the U.S. Indo-Pacific military strategy, it says that this strategy, and this is for this year, recognizes that the People's Republic of China presents America's most consequential geopolitical challenge, and that the United States' national security strategy promotes a free and open Indo-Pacific. So you have your two sides of the coin here. The economic, so free and open Indo-Pacific, meaning I can just hear it now. We're here for the as part of the PNW Pop Coalition event, where we're talking about APEC, and free and open is exactly how they describe all the free trade agreements, right? What it's supposed to do for economies. They use the same language in the national security strategy. They want to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific, but free and open for whom, right? Has to be the question we ask. Who benefits from this military strategy? It's the same people who are pushing for IPEF, for example, this year. So, just noting my time here with going back to the timeline. So the pivot to Asia gets declared in 2012. In subsequent years, you have, and actually parallel to it, right, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement being negotiated, much of it in secret. But as sort of the counterpoint free trade, thrust for neoliberalism under Obama at this time. And then we have here the Quad. So in 2017, that quadrilateral security dialogue alliance between US, Japan, Australia, and India, which had kind of floundered or not been so official for a number of years, by 2017 being reactivated, and very clearly being reactivated in the context of this countering of the rise of China, and then another official meeting happening later in 2021. So, again, as the tensions rise, you have the kind of tightening up of these alliances, whether it's in economic spheres or so-called security or military spheres, to counter that rise of China. Here in 2020, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Framework is signed. Now, this is the China-led free trade agreement, sort of the counter to the TPP, and also counter to the growing military tensions as well. So China not just sitting back and being the subject of all of this aggressive action by the US, but also shoring up its own allies in the region in its own kind of trade agreement. This was significant. It had 15 different countries part of it, as well as including all of the members of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So really significant bodies and countries that are part of this framework. And then the final item on this timeline here, the Australia, United Kingdom, United States Security Pact, or the AUKUS, brings in the UK, so one of the US's major partners in the NATO alliance, which was initially designed to counter Russia, Now the United Kingdom is here in the Pacific, and they have Australia as a partner in this security alliance. And some of the most kind of egregious aspects of this security pact is the bringing in of nuclear arms into Australia, into the Pacific, and very, clearly as a signal to China that, nuclear arms are going to be even closer to your doorstep as we bring them to Australia. Some pretty provocative meetings just held in the first few months of this year, where new submarines are being commissioned, and submarines being brought from the UK to Australia, nuclear armed subs being promised. And so it is just, more and more provocative actions under this pivot to Asia, designed to counter the rise of China. In the next few slides, we're going to look at what does this mean concretely. So if we can move to the next slide. Okay, so what does it look like? So the pivot to Asia is about, massive moving of materials, of weapons, of personnel, of and of installations and even bases into the region. On the left here is a map of the big red country is China. And what you have in the little dotted lines here are what we call on the left, the first island chain. And this is where the US is really ramping up and beefing up its military presence, kind of starting down below with Thailand and the Philippines, adding in new bases, not called bases or not called US bases, but expanding US presence within Philippine bases in the country as a way to kind of get around the Philippine Constitution, which forbids foreign bases on its soil. The US occupying those bases in the Philippines in order to form this chain. So it goes up from the Philippines. Just north of that is Taiwan. So, very important to the US, right, in the positioning toward China, and then going up to Japan and Korea. So forming, basically a chain of a place where they can fire missiles to China, places where they can practice their war games against China, places where they can practice beach landings, from Marine forces landing onto the soil of China. So, this is all, just taking place miles from the shores of China, and it is, not when they say they're there to protect their interests, they're talking about not only, this is not a defensive thing. This is very, very much, offensive posturing. And so, you have places like, Japan and Korea, which, are home to so many of the US military forces and bases outside of the United States. So that's in that region. On the right, because I know we are starting to run out of time a little bit, on the right are pictures of where we've seen the different military exercises happening, the deployments of US ships and installations. The red ones are, I believe, are the non-US kind of ships and stuff. And so you see so much militarization happening because of the conflict between the United States and China, that, the US, this is not US territory, but because they're able to use the land and the sea and the airspace of the countries with which in this pivot, they have agreements, bilateral security agreements to be able to use their land, air, sea space. You have the US military able to be there. And then you also have joint exercises, which are often being conducted in these areas here, Philippines, Japan, Korea, etc. So that's kind of what is represented in this slide. If we can go to the next one. And then I will, next slide, and I'll start to wrap up. So more on what this looks like. So on the left here in the Korean Peninsula, if we can go back up to the previous slide, sorry. The picture, yeah, there we go. So this is just from this year. So the South Korean and US militaries have really been expanding their combined military drills. Their excuse is they have to do it in response to North Korea's nuclear and missile threats and practice. But really, the United States and Korea are doing this so frequently, South Korea, even on a monthly basis, kind of these types of military exercises and drills that, there's really no comparison to, the one time North Korea does it, then there's, such a backlash. But the US military and Korean military are doing this all the time. So this is like one of the, an example of some of the military drills that they have. They fly nuclear capable bombers to the Korean Peninsula. They conduct, all these field exercises where they're practicing bombing. They've even had these exercises where they have like over 100 warplanes practicing these drills. And so, how can this not be considered provocative to North Korea? On the center slide here, you have the Philippines, and in just this past year, the largest joint military exercises ever between the Philippines and the US, and they even invited in the militaries of Australia and Japan to join in and be part of it. They sunk a ship as part of that, as part of the exercises in the Balikatan exercises this year. That's the picture at the bottom middle there. And then in Japan, you have the changing of the constitution, allowing for the rearming of the Japanese military into an offensive force and not just, a so-called defensive force. And Japan committing to a military budget that has that will double what it was before this year and next year. So, massive military buildup in Japan. And then the next slide, we do have resistance. So of course, there's going to be resistance to the using of, our different countries by the US military and by the militaries of these governments, which are in alliance with the United States. So we've had, an escalation of repression against people who are protesting against the militarization. Just this, I also want to just point out that the picture in the middle there at the bottom of the Philippines, shows like the destruction of Marawi City in the southern part of the country where, a few years ago, under the pretext of the so-called war on terror, you did have US, so-called intelligence sharing, which led to the Philippine military bombing this city to supposedly get rid of Muslim terrorists. But, that wasn't the case, and it left a city of 400,000 people totally destroyed and people displaced. In Japan, these are photos from just the most recent protest actions against the Group of Seven, the G7, which were having their summit in the country in Hiroshima. a total just slap in the face to survivors of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima by the United States. You know, the G7 leaders tried to, you know, say that they're committed to a world where you don't have, you know, a nuclear bomb dropped again. But what did they commit to? They committed to continuing to build up their nuclear arsenals as a so-called deterrent. So, I mean, it was total hypocrisy. And this is how they treated protesters, you know, heavily militarized. They brought in additional 20,000 police to lock down the city. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see the police in front of Peace Park. And this was a photo that was actually taken by Cody Urban, who you'll hear from in just a minute, who was able to be part of the protest actions there last month. So, you know, with that, I want to, you know, kind of end on the militarization is intense, and of course it will be, but the protests and the opposition continues even in the face of this kind of open-faced brutality. I'm going to turn it over now to Cody Urban, so another comrade of mine from Resist, who's going to talk more about the linkages between this military agenda of the United States and IPEF. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Rhonda. Thanks for everyone logging on today. Shout out to the Portland Watch Party, literally in the room next door. My name is Cody. I'm an organizer with the Resist US-led War Movement on the Global Secretariat, along with Carly and Rhonda. And I've been honored to be a member of the steering committee and the summit planning committee for the Pacific Northwest People Over Profit Coalition. And so when we had this opportunity to put on this this webinar as part of our lead up to the campaign against the APEC ministerial meetings in Seattle that are starting in less than 2 months. We got about a month and a half to go until we start rallying against these meetings, where they're trying to push policies to just continue everything that you've heard being spoken about so far. So how does this all relate back to APEC? I'm going to take the next few slides and try to give a crash course. There is so much to discuss when it comes to free trade deals and war. And right now we are at the precipice of a massively nuclear armed potential World War III, more so than we ever have been before. And APEC plays right into it. So these next few slides, what you're going to see is actually pictures from one of our online social media projects from Resist US-led War Movement that we call Weapons Watch. Weapons Watch, if you follow our Instagram, our Facebook, you can see our posts that come out about this. And this is a project we try to use to track the development of the war industry itself. So that's mostly transnational weapons companies. But as we've seen, as we've been making these posts and researching things about the weapons industry, is that the weapons industry and the tech industry are kind of one and the same these days. And how they're coming together to push for new laws that'll give them more access to resources and labor than they ever have before, that's where APEC comes in. It comes in because APEC this year is where they're trying to push IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And actually, if you remember back to that timeline that Rhonda was going through, unfortunately, it got cut off a little bit at the end. The last thing on there that got cut off was that IPEF was beginning to be proposed and pushed 2022. That's the year after AUKUS, the US, UK, Australia deal was passed that got nuclear submarines into Australia. So why is it that there is a military deal that got nuclear armed submarines into Australia from the US less than a year before the sort of kicking off of this plan to push IPEF? That's what we're going to talk about here. So maybe we'll just go to the next slide just to start talking. I'm not going to talk through every word by word thing here. I'm just going to kind of use this as a way to talk about the relationship of IPEF and this buildup to war. So last year, Nancy Pelosi made headlines with this massively provocative trip to Taiwan, to say the US stands with Taiwan, we're going to give weapons, as much weapons as Taiwan needs to quote unquote avoid a Chinese invasion. I just want to say, when Rhonda had mentioned that we as Resist US-led War movement supported the protests against the G7 summit in Japan, I was there with organizers from around Asia Pacific just a few weeks ago. And there were these two labor organizers from Taiwan I got to sit on the bullet train with. And they told me, they were just like, by the way, you're from the US. So what's happening in Taiwan is not like what you hear about in the US news. We're Chinese. Like, we want peaceful reunification politically with our other Chinese siblings on the mainland. Yes, it's been a rough few decades. Yes, there's not everything we agree on, but we are not thinking that China is going to invade. If anything, we've never felt this closer to war than when the US has had, since the US has started having such a big presence here. So please, this is what they said to me, like, please tell everyone you know in the US, people in Taiwan do not want war. We do not want the US here. We are Chinese. We want this matter to be a matter between Chinese people and Taiwan and the mainland, wherever they are. So every time I've been talking about Taiwan since I got back from China, I've been doing my best to push exactly what this comrade said. So Nancy Pelosi goes to visit Taiwan, and we see in the news this announcement that the US stands with Taiwan, more and more military sales are coming. What we didn't see in the news is that it was either the next day, it was the day before, or it was around the same time, Nancy Pelosi had another meeting. And that meeting was with the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC. This is the most powerful, largest high-tech semiconductor company in the entire world, to the point that I don't fully understand. I'm not a computer scientist, but I don't understand. I don't know if that's the school you're a part of that studies microchips, but I don't know a lot about microchips. But to know what it means to be considered the most high-tech microchip, quote unquote, all I've seen is that wherever I read about microchips and semiconductors, I keep hearing the same number, and that is that TSMC produces 92% of the world's most powerful semiconductors, which is basically just the component that turns electricity on and off within a circuit that goes on a microchip. It's how all computers, it's how this thing that we're watching ourselves together on is working. It's microchips. And this is where the tech industry comes back. Microchips and the semiconductors that make them work, and the manufacturing sites and the laborers that make them are being seen as the main gambling force in this current pivot to Asia that the US is making, because of this fact, again, that Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most powerful microchips. And the minerals that make up the rest of them are mostly found in the Asia Pacific region. And what Rhonda was talking about, this history of US trade deals and war, the US has spread itself out everywhere, and it's lost control of the supply chain. Whereas China's supply chain of semiconductor manufacturing, it has about 70% of everything it needs within its own borders to make all of the solar panels, computers, everything that is needed to push for new sustainable energy and digital tech. These are the pillars of IPEF. Remember what Carly had mentioned at the beginning. Sustainable energy and digital trade are main pillars of IPEF. And if China is very much in control of its supply chain and the United States is not, then a deal like IPEF that is going to secure new markets for sustainable energy and digital trade is crucial to the US empire's survival. That's how significant this free trade deal they're trying to push at APEC this year is. So back to Nancy Pelosi visiting with TSMC. After that meeting, there was a new TSMC factory promised to be opened in Arizona. The South Korean president, Son Yuk-sol, visited Washington, D.C. And there was a declaration that he and Biden gave that promised nuclear submarines to be positioned in South Korea for the first time in 40 years. That is 40 years. Again, biggest escalation that we've seen in recent years. What also happened during this time? Samsung was promised a semiconductor factory deal in Texas, and Hyundai was given an electric vehicle factory in Georgia. Then the G7 meetings happened in Japan, Hiroshima. During this time, both Intel and Micron, two of the largest microchip companies in the US, dumped all these investments in Japanese companies. So you see what's happening? There's a trend. There is a line of military meetings that get publicized, but what is not publicized is the fact that behind closed doors, tech companies in these countries are making deals to produce their stuff in the US or in other US-friendly companies. This is what IPEF is all about. It's about reshoring, or this really weird word that they call friendshoring, which pretty much takes industries that the US's allies have offshored to other countries and trying to bring it back into a quote unquote friendly zone where there's more control. And every step of the way, these tech deals have gone alongside military agreements. There can be no IPEF without the US pivot to Asia. There can be no APEC without a military competition between the states producing these things. So this slide on the right, again, you can find the whole text of these Weapons Watch slides on our social media. The Pentagon, going back to what Carly was showing at the beginning, the Pentagon this year has made a plan to invest $43 million in investment in green and digital tech production. So the Pentagon, by the way, is the world's largest carbon emitter. And so it started putting out all of this kind of propaganda saying how the Pentagon's going to go green. That is so much that comes to mind when I hear that. But imagine you see this like images of solar panels that is making us think of, a future, a livable future away from the climate crisis. But think of what went through your head when you saw that image that Carly showed us of solar panels on the wings of drones. These are drones whose civilian casualty rate has gone through the roof, and who the US has never been fully upfront about how many civilians have been killed. Does it make a difference if they're run by oil or solar panels? It matters to the Pentagon because in order for an endless supply of weapons, of high-tech weapons, which by the way, are gonna be run on sustainable energy, are gonna be chock full of tech, which means that all of it is gonna be full of these semiconductors. The only way the US can keep up with its weapons development with China is if it, quote unquote, goes green. That is the only reason why the Pentagon is behind this push for green energy. And that is the reason why green sustainable energy is a pillar of IPEF. You see, what the Pentagon says, what IPEF is saying, it is 100% the same. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Like Rhonda said, sometimes all we have to do is take it right from the horse's mouth. So these are just some quotes I'm going to read. I'm going to go counterclockwise. I'm going to start with our good friend, James Taslett. Packlet, I can't really read. He's the Lockheed Martin CEO. Please tell me what you think about the Lockheed Martin CEO in the chat right here. I would love to hear your opinions on this guy. He says a robust supply of chips is, quote, essential both to national security and to the health and defense industrial base of the aerospace industry as a whole. Okay, so this guy, again, one of the most richest people who gets rich off of war, is saying, yeah, we need microchips for national security. It's the only way we're going to have an aero defense industry. Then we go below, again, I'm going counterclockwise to US Senator John Cornyn, who says semiconductors are the new oil. The new oil rush is actually a semiconductor rush. No wonder why APEC and IPEF are both so concerned with digital trade. Now we go to the right down here to Chuck Schumer, New York Senator, literally saying our goal is we have to block the flow of chip tooling technology to China. Chuck Schumer is on a new House House committee. Have y'all heard of the House Committee on China? It's more, should be called the House Committee to Demonize China. It is pretty much like, it's very akin to the McCarthyite House on Un-American Activities from the 50s. This is a subcommittee formed just a year ago that has the most hard right-wing Republicans on it, to progressives that like Ro Khanna, who has often spoke out against war, is actually one of the biggest voices on this committee against China. This is a committee that's here just to, again, cut China off from the market that IPEF wants to get the US into. And then finally, we bring it all together. So how are we going to cut the chip tooling technology from China? Says Chuck Schumer. Let's ask Wisconsin Republican Mike Gallagher, who says we need to arm Taiwan to the teeth right now. We must clear the embarrassment that is the $19 billion foreign military sale backlog. He's referring to $19 billion worth of military sales the US was trying to okay to Taiwan and just got lost in a bureaucratic cabinet somewhere. And now all of a sudden they said, open up that cabinet, get these arms sales going. $19 billion. And who is that money going to go to if we push this arm Taiwan to the teeth deal? Right back full circle to James Taslet from Lockheed Martin, who is testifying saying, yeah, we need these microchips. They'd be good for the industry. Don't mind the fact that I actually own most of the industry here. So you see this vicious circle that is going on with just these 4 quotes, this vicious circle that our corporate CEOs and lawmakers have locked us into. This logic that just keeps feeding itself that we need to get more supply chain for semiconductors. We need to get more green energy. We need to get more big tech. And what does it all come down to? It comes down to going after the rival powers that the US wants us to be afraid of. Next slide. We have one more slide here. I'll just read these last 4 kind of summary quotes here. And that's IPEF only seeks to recapture resources. This is it's kind of a summary of everything that I've said here. And I think it's these 4 main points as we keep moving into this last month and a half before APEC starts in Seattle. This is the points we really have to push to get folks to understand what is at stake here. IPEF only seeks to recapture resources, production zones, supply chains, and consumer markets for the US's share of the global economy. A quote unquote trade war between superpowers can only ever escalate into open conflict, and it is inevitable unless we put a stop to endless competition. Digital trade and green energy are 2 main drivers of the war industry, and the industry can only increase profits through war and militarization. So in short, IPEF is leading us to the brink of potential nuclear destruction, all to line the pockets of big tech and the war industry. I really believe that the US has already made up its mind that it is going to go to war with China. What things like APEC exist for, it's to get us to come to that decision on our own and make it think like it's our idea. Things like APEC, where we talk all about how these trade deals are just another part of so-called cooperation. The kind of war propaganda that comes out telling us we need to arm Taiwan to the teeth, when as of now, like all the Taiwanese people that I've met with are saying, no, this is the US literally trying to start a civil war here, so we become the next Ukraine and the US can get off with everything. These are all deliberate moves to make us decide that the US should go to war with China, that it's in our favor. What I'm hoping this campaign can do, what our work with the Resist US-Led War movement and all of our organizations within the Pacific Northwest People Over Profit Coalition can do, is to fight back against that narrative and to say that, again, with that one phrase, people over profit, that can be a rallying cry against the push to the brink of nuclear war. And I think we can do that. And I guess with that, pass it back to you, Carly.
Thanks so much, Cody and Rhonda. As we transition into the next part of the event tonight, we really want to bring messages from 3 countries in Asia Pacific. We'll share videos from Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. And these images here sort of show where you can see Cody right here, where we were protesting against the G7 and the buildup to war in Asia Pacific, alongside other comrades. And yeah, we folks marched right past the Peace Park, saw the police militarization there, and we're there to confront the war agenda of the United States and the Western imperialist allies. So first of all, we'd like to share a statement from, can you go to the next slide, please? From Yoshio Nakamura with the Asia-wide campaign, who's based in Japan and was one of our hosts in Hiroshima in the protests against the G7. So we'll play his video first.
Hello everyone, I'm Yoshio Nakamura from Japan. The US-Japan military alliance play a key role of recent rising military tension in Asia Pacific, especially over Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. In fact, the US and Japanese forces expand joint military exercises in the region year by year. In Japan, there are over 130 US bases, around 50,000 US soldiers stations. Accidents and crimes committed by the US soldiers frequently happen, but they don't be judged by Japanese laws, with the exception of some kind of heinous crimes. The US and Japanese government tried to build a new and huge US Marine base offshore Henoko in Okinawa, southern island of Japan. It brings about further burden to Okinawan people who have suffered from concentration of the US bases in this small island. The US-Japanese military building up also impacts to people's livelihood. Japanese government increased defense budget year by year, cutting the cost for social welfare. In 2023, around 25% of Japanese military budget, or $10 billion US spent for purchasing the US-made cruise missiles, fighters, and other weapons. The so-called Constellation budget for maintaining of the US bases in Japan also increased. It is very urgent task for people in the Asian Pacific region to resist militarization in the region. Let us unite to stop US-led war drives. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So as we heard, Japan really is one of the US's most loyal allies in the Indo-Pacific, and they're actually amending their constitution against the will of the Japanese people to allow for more offensive militarization. As we can see these overseas bases in Japan, the expansion of the weapons and the participation in military exercises and alliances in the US really call on us to take up the call of Nakamura-san to take up this urgent task and resist militarization in the region and the US war drive. Next up, we would like to hear from Jang Changwon, one of our comrades with the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, the Korean Committee. Reverend Jang was also part of the delegation to dunk the G7 and protest in Hiroshima earlier this month. And since his statement is in Korean, we invite people on the webinar to read along for a translation to English on the slides to the left. And I think the sound might need to be turned on for the recording of the video. So yeah, we'll pass the word to Reverend Zhang.
저는 세계 반제국주의 플랫폼 한국위원회 공동대표 장창원입니다. 우리 예장 다솜교회 목사이며 오산 이주 노동자센터 대표입니다. 저희 교회는 오산 미군기지 공군기지에서 불과 6에 7km 떨어져서 살고 있습니다. 1945년과 한국전쟁 이후 미군들이 지금까지 70여 년 동안 한반도에 주둔하고 있으며 최근에는 28,000명이 육군과 공군으로 최신 무기로 전쟁 연습을 계속하고 있습니다. 특히 나토와 미국이 우크라이나를 통하여서 대리전을 러시아와 대리전이 시작한 지 1년여 동안 첨단 전쟁 무기로 계속해서 많은 출격과 군사훈련을 진행하고 있습니다. 주민들은 근처에 살고 있는 주민들이 전쟁이 일어날 것처럼 무섭고 불안하고 위험합니다. 세계 어느 곳에서나 미제국주의는 민중들을 침탈하고 한반도에서 전쟁이 일어난 것처럼 계속 전쟁을 하고 있습니다. 2022년에부터 지금 러시아와 우크라이나 사이에 진행 중인 전쟁은 한국과 대만을 비롯한 아시아에서도 계속된 전쟁으로 이어지고 있습니다. 한미일 전쟁 훈련으로 새로운 전쟁용 무기가 등장하고 비행기가 많이 오고 가고 있습니다. 이런 가운데 그런 전쟁의 소리는 비행기의 소리, 이러한 전쟁 연습에 많은 민중들이 피해를 입고 있고 최근에 지난 2023년 5월 6일 평택 노아리 농경지에서 F-16 전투기가 추락하여 농민들은 농업을 포기하고 그리고 그 국민들이 그곳을 방문했지만 볼 수 없도록 막아놓고 보상도 지금 하고 있지 않습니다. 만약 집과 학교, 주변 공장으로 그 비행기가 떨어졌다면 무슨 일이 일어났겠습니까? 이번 사고는 제가 사단법인 대표로 있는 에바다 장애인 복지관 근처에서 1km가 떨어져 있는 그러한 농지 지역이었습니다. 이러한 비행기 추락의 문제는 전쟁 훈련이나 탄약 보유 과정 이런 전반적인 과정에서 더 크게 일어날 수 있다는 위험이 있습니다. 우리는 매주 미군 기지를 돌아보며 감시 활동을 하고 있습니다. 또한 시민단체는 미군 기지 앞에서 미군이 화학무기 훈련을 민간인들이 살고 있는 지역에서 하는 것을 반대하는 시위를 4, 5년 동안 계속해서 하고 있습니다. 주한미군의 민가 밀집 지역에서 화학무기 훈련은 정말 하지 않아야 될 훈련입니다. 최근에 우리는 6.15 남북 화해 평화 선언을 한 지가 23년 되었습니다. 김대중, 김정일, 남북 수상들이 남북 관계는 화해를 통해서 하나로 살겠다는 그러한 결의를 하였지만 지금 남북 관계의 평화는 실종되고 언제 무력 충돌이 날지 모르는 이상한 상황입니다. 이러한 불안한 대처가 끊임없이 계속되고 있고 한미연합 실기훈련 대폭 강화, 핵무기 탑재된 미 잠수함 42년 만에 입항했고 대북전단 살포 묵인 조장, 공공연히 북한 붕괴와 흡수통일 선동, 한국 기업이 강제 동원되고 한국 기업이 강제 동원되었던 식민지 시절의 위로금을 대신 지급하겠다. 후쿠시마 오염수를 방류하는 것을 용인하고 한미일 확장 억제 협의체 구성. 이러한 한미일의 군사훈련 정례와 이러한 한미일의 관계는 우리 한반도뿐만 아니라 아시아와 세계 속에서 유럽의 나토처럼 아시아를 다른 전쟁 속으로 끌고 가기 위한 그러한 훈련을 하고 있는 것입니다. 윤석열 정부의 전쟁 주장, 망국 외교 이런 것을 심판하고자 하는 민중들의 외침이 거세지고 있고 우리는 화해와 평화로 나가기 위한 실천운동을 하고 있습니다. 지난 2023년 5월 6일 추락된 비행기의 영상을 여러분께 공유하겠습니다. 한국과 아시아의 미군 기지를 축출하기 위한 우리의 투쟁은 여러분과 함께 계속되어야 합니다. 한국과 아시아에 주둔하고 있는 미군은 나가라. 더 이상 침략 전쟁은 없다. 평화를 위해 우리는 함께 투쟁한다. 한미일 군사동맹 추진하는 윤석열을 타도하자. 그리고 아시아와 한반도 속에서 미군은 떠나라. 우리는 평화로운 평화 통일과 자주적인 우리 한반도를 만들 것이고 아시아 전쟁을 획책하는 미군을 몰아낼 것이다. 양키 고홈 아시아, 양키 고홈 월드 투데이.
Yes, U.S. out of the Asia Pacific. We don't want U.S.-led wars of aggression in Asia Pacific. We don't want these neoliberal trade deals exploiting the people of the region. Our final video message from the Asia Pacific will come from another comrade, Angelica Jelly Marcelino. Jelly is part of the Bagong Alianza Makabayan, or Bayan, from the Philippines. So next we'll pass the word over to Jelly, who was also part of the protests in Hiroshima earlier last month.
With the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, the Philippines has evolved into the largest U.S. military installation in Asia. And just this May, the U.S.-Philippine Bilateral Security Guidelines was published. The current military moves of the U.S. in the Philippines is part of a broader inter-imperialist conflict between the U.S. and China. It's a preparation for war. It's infuriating that Filipino civilians are being dragged into a growing violent inter-imperialist war. The presence of U.S. troops and military bases in the country always results in rampant human rights violations, abuses of women and children, and destruction of livelihoods and the environment. On February 2, 2023, right after the announcement of the new EDCA sites, indiscriminate aerial bombings and machine gun strafing were carried out in the communities of Barangay Hacienda Intal, Bagao, Cagayan. 150 families were forcibly evacuated from their homes, leaving their livelihoods behind. Bagao, Cagayan is just 2 hours away from the planned US base at Lalo Airport. Local groups believe that the military operations are meant to clear the area of possible resistance to US facilities. This is just one of the many documented incidents of indiscriminate military operations carried out by the armed forces of the Philippines. The bombs and artillery used by the military are supplied by the United States government. Aside from displacing communities, the construction of 2 new naval EDCA sites is expected to cause another toxic pollution in Philippine soil, just like how the Clark and Subic Bay bases devastated communities in the 1990s. Another growing concern is the attraction of prostitution and the exploitation of women and children in U.S. bases. Hundreds of abuse cases have been committed by U.S. troops against Filipino women. We will never forget the impunity of erring U.S. troops, the Subic rape case of Daniel Smith, who raped Nicole, and the brutal murder of trans women Jennifer Laude by Joseph Scott Pemberton, a case considered by the AFP as an isolated case. The U.S. military has always been instrumental in the development of a counterinsurgency program in the country, which has led to the killings and attacks against human rights defenders. We now have the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 that terrorists tag activists and the opposition. It aims to suppress dissent and all movements for democracy and human rights. Even with all these challenges, the People's Movement continues in exposing and opposing all forms of U.S. imperialist intervention in the Philippines, as well as U.S. provocations in the region. We stand for Philippine sovereignty and regional peace, and we refuse to be dragged in the U.S.-China inter-imperialist conflict.
Thank you so much to Jelly and Bayan for your agitating statement. We echo the call for justice for Jennifer Laude and all victims of US military aggression in the Asia Pacific, to junk the anti-terror law and all forms of state repression that are part of the war machine. And we'll continue to stand in solidarity with our comrades across Asia Pacific, whether it be military base expansion in the Philippines, new nuclear submarine deployment near Japan, or military exercises threatening the people of South Korea. We must see an end to the militarization of the region, and we stand behind the people who are resisting the buildup to war on the front lines. To zoom in to our local region in the Pacific Northwest, we would like to invite members of Resist US-Led War in Seattle to come on screen. Let us know about your campaign work against war and APEC, and how people can join in the resistance. So we'll invite Resist US-Led War Seattle, if you can unmic and turn on video.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I'll talk a little bit about our campaign then and how people can plug and fight back here in Seattle. So hello, my name is Victor. I'm with the Seattle chapter of Resist US-Led War Movement. And first of all, thank you so much for having me and providing this opportunity for us to plug our campaign, but also show how our local fight here in Seattle is related to the US-led arms buildup and trade war in the Asia Pacific itself. So I'm live here from the University of Washington, where we're having our watch party in Seattle. Want to say hi? Yeah, you could hear that, I bet. But not only where we're having our watch party, it's also where Boeing, the third largest transnational weapons corporation in the world, produces and has tremendous influence here on campus, students, and also the community of Seattle. In this campus, both Boeing's B-29 and B-52 bomber jets were tested in wind tunnels that are funded by Boeing and created by Boeing. And these planes carried some of the worst atrocities of US imperialism, produced by US imperialism, conducting mass bombs and campaigns in Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Today, the UW campus, on UW campus, drones sold by the armed force, drones sold to the armed forces of the Philippines are prototyped here by students, and again, not with the knowledge. Students don't have the knowledge that most of the times. Boeing is set to invest $50 million over the next 5 years and build up a AI institute and entrench even more students in its war production and in this pipeline of students to war manufacturing. because of this confrontation with China to come. And as we've learned during this presentation and during the webinar, war profiteers like Boeing take advantage of this free trade deals led by APEC and IPEF. The US explicitly frames IPEF as a countermeasure to China's free trade deals in the region, and by establishing APEF as a means of economic and supply chain control, the US also uses this economic relationships to expand the military bases and presence in the Asia Pacific. Organizations like APEC cite counterterrorism and disaster preparedness as a justification for this increased militarization, right? But in participating nations, notably around ports and borders, this so-called security is reserved for corporate investments and not for the people. National security is a violent reality for many, including the migrants who are subjected to brutal dehumanization conditions. Corporations like Boeing benefit from this neoliberal policy by making it easier for weapons manufacturers to export arms with the minimal oversight, and also by having access to these natural resources to produce these weapons. The proliferation of this industry has impacted national militaries and paramilitaries, and also contributes to the militarization of police forces, both here and outside of the US. But just as the State Department pushes forward its exploitative trade agenda against the skepticism of its so-called partners and against a chorus of opposition from the people like us, and just as the US military overextends itself in a shaky pivot to Asia, Boeing overstands its welcome here at the University of Washington. So students and community members like us here in the Watch Party, yes, thank you so much, are voicing our opposition and also fighting back. Through our campaign, UW Cut Ties with Boeing, which we've been organizing for around a year now, we've held Tichin, Stable, Flyered, and combed through public records to expose this war machine on campus and its relationships with the campus administration and this neoliberal education institution. We have confronted the Board of Regents and also shut down a seminar hosting a Boeing Vice President, Melissa Orm, making it clear that war profiteers are not welcome here and that our demand, UW Cut Ties with Boeing, needs to be met as soon as possible. And just to emphasize, we'll be everywhere that Boeing is until this demand is met. That's it from us.
UW Cut Ties with Boeing, cut ties with war profiteers. Let's go resist Seattle. So proud to be a part of this organization. Yes, and we know that Boeing directly backs APEC. It's part of the National Center for APEC, based here in Seattle, and does a lot of its production in Everett, in Renton, in this region. And yeah, has a lot to do with why the ministerial meetings pertaining to Asia Pacific are here in Boeing's backyard. So thank you so much for your work, and really excited to see Resist in the streets July 29th and 30th to protest against APEC and Boeing. All right, and now we will pass it south down to Portland and invite folks from Clown Block to let us know what you are bringing up to Seattle in July to protest against APEC.
Hello, everybody. We are Clown Block. We are members of the Resist US-led movement, or Resist US-led war movements, and members of the Anti-APEC People's Summit. We use tactics like clown, radical joy, and spectacle as a method of fighting against imperialism. To that end, we will be bringing Bong Bong Marcos Jr., illegitimate president of the Philippines and APEC member. We'll be bringing him with us up to Seattle in July to make a big spectacle against APEC and the masters that control their puppets. We would love to have you there. Come support us. If you do, don't forget to register. Please donate and come on down. It'll be a fun time unless you're an imperialist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're excited to see the puppet. We're excited to fight against puppets like Bongbong Marcos and all the other heads of state, including so many fascist leaders who will be coming to the United States in the coming months. And then their finance ministers, their trade ministers that are already meeting and negotiating against the people to sell out the people for profit. So with that, can we go to the next slide? Thank you so much to Resist Seattle and Clown Block. And we are really here to organize. We think that this education is really important. And at the same time, we know that big tech is organized. They are organized and they are trying to develop new free trade deals like IPEF so that they can expand their profits. These imperialists will stop at nothing. They will militarize. They will exploit the workers. They will destroy the planet in order to meet their bottom line. And we know that this fight against trade and resource wars is a fight against the buildup to the violent wars themselves. So Resist would like to put out the call. We'd like to join all the organizations who've spoken today and over the last several months, and all those organizations that will come out to fight with us against APEC. This is not the end. We definitely want people to be able to organize alongside us and join the fight. So our call to our communities all across the PNW, the US, and internationally is cut ties with war profiteers, say no to war buildup for profit in the Pacific, and fight against the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum this year in the US. And we will pass it on to Robin to tell everyone how folks can get involved and plug in and join the campaign.
Thanks, Carly. Can we go to the next slide, please? Awesome. So we are organizing a counter summit against APEC on July 29th and 30th, which is going to include workshops for education. It's going to include counter protests. There's going to be a lot going on, and we really want to make this as big as possible in order to demonstrate to APEC, to all of these companies and imperialists, that they do not have people's support. So what you can do if you're feeling enthused about getting involved is you can sign on to the campaign as either an individual or on behalf of your organization if you are in a position to do that. You can sign up to participate in the mobilization here in Seattle. And if you are not in Seattle, we are going to do everything that we can to get people up here for it. And to that end, we would love to receive donations from people for the costs of transportation, hotels, food, printing zines and other prop, just any of the logistical things that we need in order to make this a success. I see a question in the chat, will the July summit be live streamed? I do not know the answer to that right now, but it would be awesome if we could do that. But, oh yes, apparently. But yes, please do check out our website, bit.ly/pnw-pop. It has links to all of the ways that you can support us. And please do follow Resist, because most of the educational stuff and events that we do will be posted on their social media as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, we really hope that people will sign on to the campaign. If your organization has not yet become a sponsor, an endorser, or a signatory of the campaign, we really hope that you will sign on. If you're an individual and you would like to get involved, we have a lot of committees that are still doing a lot of work between now and July 29th. So we would love to have you also fill out this sign on to the campaign link, and we will follow up to get you plugged in. We really can't do this without the community support. So if you're able to donate even $5, $10, or a larger donation, or if you're connected to folks with resources, we would really, really appreciate any support you can offer to really push forward and fight back against these many, many billion-dollar ruling class elites that will be trampling all over our city and all over the Asia Pacific. So yes, we would love your support. With that, if we can go to the next slide. While people take a look at these links, they're all posted in the chat as well. Please take time to visit our website and find out more to plug in. But please, yeah, drop it in the chat. How will you support the fight against APEC and war? Part of the question got cut off here. But if you can drop it in the chat, let us know how will you be able to support, whether that's talking to just one other person, sharing what you learned tonight, making a donation, joining a committee. We would love to see how we can build and grow the mass movement, not just against IPEF and APEC, but against the whole neoliberal system, against this imperialist system that is trampling on the sovereignty of so many people all around the world, including workers here in the US and all oppressed people. If folks can also post in the chat if you have any major questions for us, how to get involved, or any questions about the content from tonight, please feel free to also drop those in the chat. We have about 15 minutes for discussion and any questions that you'd like to raise. Looks like we've got some pretty incredible support. Looks like we're gonna have guests from San Diego coming up to the Bay in November. We've got folks coming up to Seattle to protest alongside us. We've got folks reaching out to other organizations, to students, to coworkers. This is really exciting. Let's see, not seeing any questions at the moment, but yeah, I can also, oh, there is one question here. What happened at the Detroit APEC and IPEF meetings? Let's see, Cody, could I pass it to you to share a little bit about what we've learned via ILPS US and comrades that were out there?
Yeah, maybe I'll say a bit about what APEC did in Detroit, and then I'll pass it to Rhonda to say about what ILPS and the people did in Detroit. In Detroit, it was so this upcoming meeting in Seattle called a ministerial meeting. It's because it's literal government ministers who are meeting. And there's ministers of different departments, right? Whether it's what we call secretaries here in the US, Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Treasury, Defense. They're called ministers also in other countries. So like there'll be, in Seattle, there are going to be ministerial meetings for energy. So the energy secretaries and energy ministers are all going to meet and talk about how are we going to change our laws to make it easier to expand the energy industry and investment for it. Similarly, in Detroit, that's just the context of how these meetings are working behind closed doors on our tax budget. In Detroit, there was a big meeting for transportation ministers. And so they passed these big like statements about how we're going to green the transportation sector. A big one about the maritime sector. Again, it's great. These are big gas guzzling cargo ships and trains that you see. So I'm all for sustainable energy of the transportation sector. But remember what the essence is here. The essence is controlling access to the supply chains and resources. And so that's what the ministers did in Detroit. They met to talk primarily about how we are going to green the transportation industry. And there was all the main railroad companies, car companies, shipping companies there with their big bucks in hand to lobby with them to push for those laws to be passed in their favor. So that's one thing that happened. But Rhonda, if you're available, why don't you tell us what people's response was on the street to that?
So the people's response, there was a day of workshops and basically a counter summit to the IPEF meetings that were going on. There were several workshops all day, including one held by the International League of People Struggle, which is one of the conveners of the No to APEC coalition. It focused on, what is APEC and what are the impacts on working people. And there was a big street mobilization against the ministers' meeting, and included unions and community organizations, faith-based organizations. So the response was, we have to fight APEC, we have to fight IPEF. We don't only want workers at the table, we actually want trade that is for the people, an economy that's for the people and for workers. And it's, not about, making tiny little tweaks to the IPEF, but really scrapping it and wanting genuine trade based on, genuine independence and sovereignty of countries. So that was the people's response. And it was just a first round, and I can't wait to see how many more people come out in July in Seattle, and then in November in San Francisco.
Thank you, Cody and Rhonda. We do have another question in the chat about why some of the countries in Asia Pacific are joining in the US militarization. So if anyone has a response to that question, feel free to, share your thoughts.
So one thing that a very common thread between Nakamura-san's, Comrade Zhang's, and Comrade Jelly's points that they raised in their videos between Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, all of them pointed out that they don't think that their government has their own interests at stake. Each of them talked about how the governments are pushing for decisions that are actually putting their people more at risk. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, is that the governments of these countries, the people who are in charge, know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly the payoffs that they can get from this. Zhang talked about Yoon Suk-yeol, the president of South Korea, and this major push for these big new military agreements, this new agreement to have US nuclear submarines in South Korea, and for this trilateral military agreement between the US, Japan, and South Korea. He's super connected to the business class. His family comes from business interests in South Korea. These companies that are being given the rights to open up these factories, these tech factories, are incredibly repressive towards their workers. They're highly exploitative on the workshop floor. That's why there's so much US investment going into them. It's easier to get more bang for their buck when US investors are investing in tech manufacturers in South Korea. And so the presidents, again, the heads of state, share these interests, and that is why they are putting their countries into these bigger, more enhanced military agreements with the US. They're doing it because they see a stake for themselves. But what the people in these countries are all saying is that this is not a stake for us. And that's the thing that we have to remember in this campaign, is that this is also a campaign of international solidarity with the people who are fighting back against that. But Rhonda, I don't know if you have more also to say to that.
Nothing to add. Thank you, Cody.
I noticed another question here. Isabel noticed that multiple Latin American countries are involved in APEC, such as Peru and Chile. Is anyone able to offer some perspective on how the people of those countries are specifically affected by APEC and what their government involvement is? And maybe to start, I'll share that Peru is actually the 2024 host of APEC, and the recent coup and then the massive state repression that many indigenous communities and campesinos are facing in their protests and responses to the coup and demand for genuine democracy really shows sort of the alignment that, like folks have said, the US is trying to force among its allies all around the Pacific. Yeah, Cody or Rhonda, do you all have additions?
Well, first off, let's give a huge shout out to the people of Chile who shut down APEC the last time they came to their country. That's the inspiration we need. Wherever APEC goes, the people fight back. And the people of Chile really came out hard for that. I actually saw an infographic from a website 2 days ago that showed the world's largest lithium reserves. I think Chile's #2, Australia's #1, Chile's #2. I think Peru is up there in lithium, but I think that there is more. Both Peru and Chile have massive copper reserves. So lithium is needed for lithium ion batteries. This is the main battery used by Tesla, all these other companies in making their renewable energy batteries. So again, sustainable energy, one of the main pillars of IPEF. Lithium is a main point, and copper then actually makes the wiring that all the electricity goes through in this tech. So both Chile and Peru have major roles in APEC when the APEC countries are trying to see how to, again, reshuffle the supply chain so that they can own production in this. But yeah, once again, shout out to Chile, shutting down APEC. That's the inspiration we need.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, we can see in the chat that folks are adding more points to the conversation, which is exactly what we hope to do at the People Summit, July 29th and 30th. July 29th, we will have, like Robin mentioned, a great gathering of activists, of environmentalists, people's organizations, grassroots folks, unions, churches, everybody that we can invite together to form a united analysis. And more importantly, to continue to take that analysis into the streets and directly confront APEC in Seattle on July 30th. So as someone born and raised in Seattle, I hope that a lot of people come so that we can kick all of the capitalists, their alliances, and their corporations out of Seattle. And that once we get to the fight in the Bay Area in November, that we have even more people and more force to strike a blow against APEC and US imperialism. So yes, we really appreciate everyone's participation. And as a final reminder, please do sign on to the PNW POP campaign. Please join us at the People Summit and protest against APEC. If you can't make it, but you can send resources, please donate. And we hope that you learn more about PNW POP and Resist US-led war movement as we resist the buildup to war in Asia Pacific and fight against APEC. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We will share out the recordings and slides with everyone, and we will see you in the struggle. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Thank you.